Hello, we welcome you to the Bible study today. The lesson is on the book of Job. So if you will, turn to Job chapter 7, and let's begin our study today. Job chapter 7 and verse 1. Is there not a time of hard service for man on earth? Are not his days also like the days of a hired man? In verses 1 to 5, we see Job's second speech. He continues it from the previous chapter. In verses 1 to 5, he describes his suffering. Job begins by looking at the suffering of mortal men in general. First, he says that man has a time of hard service while on earth. It is true that at this time in his life was a struggle. Second, he said his days are like those of a hired man who works in service of another. Verse 2. Like a servant who earnestly desires the shade, and like a hired man who eagerly looks for his wages. Mortal man is like a servant who eagerly, earnestly desires or longs for the shade, perhaps shade from the sun. This may be translated as literally pants for, like one might pant out of thirst or out of heat. He is like a hired man who eagerly looks or waits to be paid his wages at the end of the day. He's had a long day and he's looking forward to receiving his pay and going home. Job longed for the end of his life of hard service. What of the reward? Chapter 7, verse 1, if the servant had the shade and the hired man had his wages, what of the reward of Job at the end of his life? Perhaps Job looked to his reward, service to God, not simply the release from his pain that he was experiencing at that time. Verse 3. So I have been allotted months of futility, and wearisome nights have been appointed to me. Job now looks at his own suffering in particular. Instead of the shade, as earnestly desired by the servant, in verse 2, and wages as earnestly looked for by the hired man, Job has been appointed only months of futility and wearisome nights. Think of how this must describe his nights, of how his nights must have dragged on for Job and how restless were his nights. It appears that Job's affliction has continued on and on for months now. Job 7 and 3 and Job 29 and verse 2. Verse 4, when I lie down, I say, when shall I rise and the night be ended? For I have had my fill of tossing till dawn. Job lies down to sleep. However, the nights are wearisome to him. He lies awake at night thinking about how much longer it will be before he will get up and the night will be over and have ended. Have you ever had nights like that? Restless, wearisome nights. He tosses and turns in bed till the dawn of morning. And certainly this would make for long, long nights. In his situation, he certainly needed rest. He needed sleep, and he wasn't getting rest or sleep. Verse 5. My flesh is caked with worms and dust. My skin is caked and breaks out afresh. Here he describes his illness, whatever his illness may have been. His flesh is caked with worms of decay, maggots, and encrusted with dust. His skin cracks and breaks open afresh. One might imagine pus coming from the open wounds in the flesh. A graphic image of his suffering, his affliction. And so here he's caked with these worms, or clothed with these worms of decay. In verses 6 to 10, Job feels helpless. My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle and are spent without hope. Job's days, he said, are swifter than a weaver's shuttle. And so this very fast instrument, while his nights drag on, looking back, his days pass by quickly and come to an end without hope. And so he spends his nights, or his nights come to an end. Verse 7. Oh, remember that my life is a breath. My eye will never again see good. Job describes his life as a breath. His life is lived, he says, in futility, Job 7:3. He does not expect that he will ever again see good. He simply couldn't see anything good that awaited him here in this life. Job 14:1 and 2, man who is born of woman is of few days and full of trouble. He comes forth like a flower and fades away. He flees like a shadow and does not continue. It seems that Job disagreed with what Eliphaz said earlier in Job 5:17 to 27. In the New Testament, James the disciple wrote in James 4:14, whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow, for what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. And so Job used similar language. Many commentators believe that Job addresses God in this passage. If so, this is the first time he directs his words to God, perhaps in prayer. And so one version explains the passage by supplying the term God. Remember, O God. However, Job may simply have been addressing Eliphaz. That's a possibility. Verse 8. Now later on, he certainly does address Job, or does address God with his complaints and protest. Verse 8. The eye of him who sees me will see me no more. While your eyes are upon me, I shall no longer be. The time is coming that man will no longer see him. At the time, Eliphaz and his friends could lay their eyes upon him. However, the time was coming when they would look for him, but he would no longer be. He would no longer be alive. His situation was dire. Verse 9. As the cloud disappears and vanishes away, so he who goes down to the grave does not come up. The cloud in the sky disappears and vanishes. How many times have you looked at the sky and see clouds form and soon dissipate, disappear, vanish away? Likewise, Job expected to go down to death, the grave in death, to disappear and vanish away, not to be seen again on the earth. The term grave in this passage is from the Hebrew term Sheol, and Sheol refers to the abode of the dead. This Hebrew term Sheol is the Greek equivalent of Hades in the New Testament. See a comparison between Psalm 16:10 and Acts 2:31. We see the Hebrew word and the Greek word used in parallel. And so this place is the waiting place, the dwelling place of those who have died, awaiting the judgment. Zophar speaks of the deep things of God in Job 11:8. He said, they are higher than heaven. What can you do? Deeper than Sheol. What can you know? And so he speaks of heaven as high and Sheol is deep. And so sometimes that word Sheol is rendered as grave or pit in the Old Testament. Verse 10, he shall never return to his house, nor shall his place know him anymore. He speaks of the finality of death. After he went down to the grave, he would not come up from the grave again, nor return to his house or his home here on earth. He would not be seen again in this world. It's true, apart from the miraculous, that the dead do not rise again. Job did not expect to return to his home on earth after death. When we die, we see this place mentioned as Sheol or Hades, but ultimately the judgment and then eternity. What about life after death? We see glimmers in the Old Testament, but fuller picture in the New. Life after death. This does not mean that Job had no hope of life after death. He simply states the truth about death, the finality of death. Apart from the power of God, he would go down to the grave and not come up again. He would leave his house and would not return, nor would people see him again in this world. Later, Job writes of his hope. Job 19:25-27. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and he shall stand at last on the earth. After my skin is destroyed, this I know, that in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another. How my heart yearns within me. And so later on, Job 19:25-27, he speaks of hope beyond this world, hope beyond life here and after death in this world. I know that my Redeemer lives. Verses 11-16. However, in this passage, he's suffering, he's going through this ordeal, and he talks of the finality of death, and he hopes for death, given his great suffering. Verse 11. Therefore, I will not restrain my mouth. I will speak in anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. Verses 11-16, he offers complaints to God. If he wasn't speaking to God earlier, he certainly is now, though he very well may have already. But we see here in this passage how he addresses his complaints to God. Job will not restrain his mouth. He will not keep silent. He will speak out in his anguish and complain in his bitterness. He is speaking from a place of great grief and tragedy. He lost his children, his sons and his daughters. He lost his property. He lost his servants. He lost his health. And now he's being accused by his friends of sin for the reason of his suffering. Now, later, we see how Job regrets his complaints to God, that he spoke in grief and ignorance. Job 7:11-21, he complains. Oftentimes people complain when they're suffering, and oftentimes for far less than the suffering of Job. Verse 12, am I a sea or a sea serpent that you set a guard over me? In the New King James Version, pronouns referring to deity are capitalized, and these are indicated by the translators for the purpose of aiding the reader in recognizing God when he is referred to in the scriptures. This can be helpful, and we see this here in verse 12. The pronoun you is capitalized, and so the translators, the New King James, believe that this pronoun refers to God. And so he is speaking to the Lord. Am I a sea? What does he mean by that? Well, first, Job says that he is not a sea. He's not an ocean. One might think of someone watching the sea for danger, maybe from a lighthouse. Job says that he is not a sea serpent. He's not dangerous like a sea creature or a beast. He did not need to be watched or constantly under guard. And so Job complains that God's actions toward him are out of proportion to what he has done. He's no monster, no moral monster. Verse 13. When I say, my bed will comfort me, my couch will ease my complaint, then you scare me with dreams and terrify me with visions. And so Job thinks that he will get some comfort as he sleeps in bed and rests on his couch. And we already saw how that worked out earlier. His nights were wearisome. He could not sleep. But he thought, well, if I can go to bed, perhaps I can be comforted in my sleep. Perhaps my couch will ease my complaint. And he had his complaints. Verse 14, then you scare me with dreams and terrify me with visions. And so Job tried to sleep and then was frightened during his sleep as he had these dreams or visions that terrified him. And instead of finding comfort in bed, he finds terror. His complaints remain. Verse 15. So that my soul chooses strangling and death rather than my body. Job says that his soul chooses death rather than his body. This may be translated literally as my bones. And so my soul chooses strangling and death rather than my bones. Well, what does that mean? Well, simply put, he would prefer to die than to continue suffering like this in his body. He would even prefer a strangling death or suffocation than to continue to breathe while in pain. Here we see that he said, my soul chooses strangling death. The term "and" is italicized in the New King James. It indicates that these words were added for sake of clarity by the translators, and oftentimes they too help aid the reader. Of course, you could read this passage without the "and," and it would say, so that my soul chooses strangling death rather than my body. Verse 16. I loathe my life. I would not live forever. Let me alone, for my days are but a breath. Job loathes, he hates his life now in his suffering. He does not wish to continue to live if it means his suffering. As his days were brief, he wanted God to leave him alone so that he could spend his last few days in peace. Harsh words said in grief to God. Many, though, today have told God, let me alone, leave me alone, and they did so for far less. Job suffered greatly. In verses 17 to 21, Job protests his affliction. What is man that you should exalt him, that you should set your heart on him? Job wants to know why God would exalt man or lift him up. Other versions read magnify him or make so much of him. Why does God set his heart so on man? He describes God as being concerned about man and giving him such attention. This passage is similar to what we read in David's Psalm 8. The psalmist David praised the Lord who created the moon and the stars of the heavens. Man seems insignificant in comparison to the rest of the creation, moon and stars. Yet God made man as the pinnacle of his creation and has given him glory and honor. Psalm 8, 3-5, David said, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you visit him? For you have made him a little lower than the angels, and you have crowned him with glory and honor. The message, or the passage in the book of Job and the passage in the book of Psalms are similar. One might not have been based upon the other, however. It may be that they are similar by inspiration. God planned it that way. What, though, is the difference? Well, the psalmist wonders what there is about man that causes God to so honor him, while Job wonders what there is about man that causes God to so test him. Verse 18. He said that you should visit him every morning and test him every moment. And so what is man that you should visit him? The term visit is used in the sense of examine. In this passage, visit is parallel with test or try. The same term is also rendered punishes in Job 31:14 and punished in Job 35:15. Why do you continually test man? Why do you visit him every morning? Why do you test him over every moment? Why do you continually examine him? Verse 19, how long will you not look away from me and let me alone till I swallow my saliva? Job asks, how long will God continually test him? Verse 18. Job complains that God continues to test him, to try him, not looking away from him, so that he does not even have time to swallow his own spit. Saliva, spittle. God won't let me alone, even for an instant. Verse 20. Have I sinned? What have I done to you, O watcher of men? Why have you set me as your target, so that I am a burden to myself? Job asks God, have I sinned? A literal translation of this is simply as in the King James, I have sinned. Job never claimed to be sinless. And while Job had sinned, he did not sin to the extent accused by his friends. He did not plow iniquity and sow trouble, as we see in Job 4:8, as said by his friends. Job, as he did to his friends, now asked God to show him his sin. Have I sinned? I have sinned. Show me my sin. Job 6:24-30. He asked God why God set him as his target, so as to become a burden to himself. Why, God, have you made me your target or your mark? Verse 21. Why then do you not pardon my transgression and take away my iniquity? For now I will lie down in the dust, and you will seek me diligently, but I will no longer be. Job asked God why he does not pardon his transgression and take away his iniquity. Have I sinned? I have sinned. Show me my sin. Here in verse 21, why then do you not pardon me of my sin? He told God that he would soon die and that God would no longer have him as a target or a mark. He would look and not find him, for he will no longer be. Words said in grief. Job confessed earlier in Job 6:3 that his words were rash. And in Job 6:26, that he was desperate. When we are in grief and we are suffering, sometimes our words are rash, spoke in the heat of the moment. Sometimes we speak desperately. Job later in Job 42:3, after finally hearing from the Lord, realizes that what he uttered, he did not understand. What he said, things too wonderful for him to comprehend, things which he did not really know. We can see as we study the book of Job that Job was in the dark about many things that were going on in his life. He didn't know why he was suffering. We know because we have the benefit of inspiration of reading the book. However, Job did not have that benefit. All he knew, he was suffering. He was a God-fearing man. He was a man who was upright and blameless, as said by God himself in the book. However, he said some things that were rash. He said some things that were of a desperate man, things that he didn't understand. Job 42:3. Sometimes people today say far worse and don't have the rationale that we see here in Job, the great things that he endured. But Job maintained his integrity. He did not curse God, and he was a man of patience too. He persevered. But that didn't mean that he was perfectly sinless. He had sinned, but he could not think of any sin that he had committed that would make him receive such suffering. He didn't know. Let's learn from Job. Certainly, there's more that we can understand, we can learn ourselves in our study, and go ahead and continue to study. I encourage you to do so. There's more to learn than what we've been able to talk about today, but hopefully this has been beneficial to you. And Lord willing, next time we'll continue with our study. Thank you for being here today.